Welcome, everybody, to the Capitalism Workshop hosted by the Socialist Project and the Center for Social Justice. We've been hosting a series of talks beginning in the summer and will continue through the fall and winter, on various issues related to the contemporary capitalism and particularly political responses to the crisis and debating various theoretical and political issues related to the left. Today's discussion picks up on one of the central political and dynamics of analyzing the current conjuncture, a moment where there is extensive delegitimation of the central institutions of neoliberalism, from the WTO to the IMF to different issues related to the monetary policy and so on. A considerable political opening and crisis that has also delegitimated the center-left and the center-right parties, the Social Democratic and the Christian Democratic parties in Europe, and also the centrist parties in North America. That has left a lot of political space open. Much of this political space has been occupied by elements of the far right and the alt-right in North America, a range of political of forces organized, varying to the Golden Dawn in Greece, to Jobbik in Hungary, to a range what John will speak about, the FD in Germany and so forth. A whole array of forces have been formed. We've been holding workshops on these developments actually since 2015, when we hosted a series of talks related to putting out the Socialist Register 2016 on the politics of the right. We hosted Bill Fletcher and a bunch of other talks over the last couple of years on this issue. We are lucky to have two people who've been researching this issue extensively in Europe, about Europe, and in Europe, since Stefan is just back. John Kannankulam teaches political science at the University of Marburg in Germany. He's been writing extensively on Polancis and the European Union, and has been following clearly the developments of the FD in Germany. His most recent book is Reading Polancis on the Contemporary Relevance of Marxist State Theory. They will be speaking on the topic Cracks and Fissures in Europe, Authoritarian Statism, the Hard Right and Left Challenges. We'll begin with John and then we'll turn to Stefan. So John, kick it off and welcome to Toronto.
Well, Greg, thank you for this nice invitation and introduction. I'm glad to be here during my short-term stay. I'm just here for 3 months. Actually, I wasn't planning to do some academic stuff. I'm on my sabbatical, but I'm very glad to be here to give this short presentation. And I have to apologize to Greg and Leo, since part of what I'm going to present you already know, you already heard of me, but I think there's a lot of other people who probably haven't, so let's see how it works out. And in my presentation, I'm actually not too much concentrating on the recent developments in Germany and the uprise of the AfD, but what I would rather do is to go back to have a look at the Euro crisis and the situation when the AfD appeared first in Germany, out of the cracks and fissures within the neoliberal hegemony project, as we name it, in Germany. Well, what I'm going to discuss in the following from a neo-Poulantzasian perspective is the question what relationship of forces are to be identified behind the European crisis programs labeled as economic governance in a phase in which the Euro crisis was on a dramatic height in 2012. It was in this context that the German Alternative für Deutschland, Alternative for Germany, which is this nice guy, Lucke, and the poster says, the Euro is ruining Europe and us. So this is it tells us something what this party was all about. And as I said, we're speaking in the following minutes. I'll be concentrating for the time when this party popped up. Well, this party popped up in 2013, but now it is dominated, as you probably know, by the radical right and neo-Nazi forces, and which appeared and started its success story in 2012-13, and finally, 8 weeks ago, entering the German Bundestag as the third strongest force in the recent elections with 12.6%, which means 96 seats out of 709. We have 96 far-right, neo-Nazi, fascist people sitting in the German Bundestag. out of 709, or in other numbers, 5.8 million people voted for them from out of 61 eligible voters. This is quite a story. Well, and coming from a Marxist state theoretical perspective, I don't have to tell you, that's why you invited me, with a neo-Polanzasist background especially, one of our meaning is my colleagues Sonja Buckel, Jens Wissel and I, we did a research about the struggles about European migration policies, which is the book below. Our basic research question was how the famous notion of Poulanzas, that the state is a material condensation of a relationship of forces, could be deployed for empirical research generally within the European Union especially. Our idea, building up on the work of Bastian van Apeldoorn, Leo Bieling, Jochen Steinhilber, Bob Jessup and others, was to conceptualize this problem of how to get a notion of this relationship of forces thing with the idea of picking up of the idea about projects. Projects we understand as an analytical aggregation of similar strategies pursued by a set of heterogeneous actors competing around a social or political conflict, like in our case, the Europeanization of migration control policies, or what I'm going to talk about in the next minutes, about the Euro crisis. So the project is the idea that we aggregate several actors and their strategies and cluster them together. Those people probably don't know that they're part of a project. That's what we do. We cluster them and to get a grip about this idea, what is the relationship of forces. And that was our idea how to deal with this problem. And thus the almost infinite constellation of relationship of forces within society is conceptually aggregated into a set of similar strategies pursued by competing actors around a political conflict, as I said, which we name hegemony projects. We have been in our research able to identify 5 such hegemony projects that were competing around migration control policies and European integration generally. But these projects are, of course, also to be found in the question about the Eurozone crisis and other issues. Those 5 hegemony projects, just to give a little detail about it, are furthermore to be distinguished with regards to the specific general strategy, their social base, the identifiable relevant actors, and their material and or symbolic resources, which they follow specific tactics in trying to hegemonize their particular interests. This is the 5 projects. I'll briefly tell you what they're all about. I mean, about the neoliberal hegemony project, I probably don't have to say too much, since this is the obvious dominant one. Probably it got, for a short term, into a hegemonic or legitimate crisis, but obviously I think it's, the question is if the authoritarian solutions that came up recently about this thing is something to do about hegemony or not, but we can discuss this later on. Well, the general strategy of this project, of the neoliberal one, is a market-oriented, competitive reorganization of almost every aspect of social life and state politics. The political guidelines are flexibilization of production and work relations, the reduction of state expenditure, the internationalization of capital, as Liu has worked on for years, trade and chains of production, plus, and this is relevant for our research, also the mobility of the global workforce within the context of a neo-colonial international division of labor. What was interesting about our migration research was that the neoliberal actors were finally for open borders. They want a global labor market. They don't want too much protection. They want demand and the market rules to work here. The social basis for this hegemony project in neoliberal are the key sectors of the globalized post-forest accumulation regime, the financial sector and the big transnational companies. The relevant actors are transnational banks, industrial companies, the head of organizations of capital, and at the European level, the European Round Table, Business Europe, and other think tanks like the Bertelsmann Foundation in Germany. The resources of this hegemony project are obviously its economic power, since the business volume of many transnational companies equates the GDP of middle-sized national economies. Contrasting this neoliberal hegemony project, we found 4 other projects competing. That is the National Social Hegemony Project and the Pro-European Social Hegemony Project. The National Social Hegemony Project is not as national socialistic, meaning Nazi. I will tell you in a minute. This notion comes from Etienne Balibar. You probably know about it. Yeah. The general strategy of the National Social Hegemony Project and the Pro-European Project is social equality, and redistribution, and the focal point of this project is defending the European social model. So that's a social issue. But in their aim to do this, each of these projects follows different specific strategies. The National Social Hegemony Project does not follow a pan-European strategy, but a national defense strategy. The social basis of both projects, the National Social and the Pro-European Social Hegemony Project, are the remaining sectors of the Fordist model and industries, white or indigenous, mainly male-scale labor, plus the public sector and medium-sized capital with a national accumulation basis. The relevant actors are, besides the already mentioned factions of production parts of the unions, welfare organizations, and socially oriented wings of the Christian churches and their bases in conservative parties and organizations. The material resources of this hegemony projects are coming from the above mentioned sectors, but furthermore, a main strategic discursive resource of this project is coming from, in Germany or in Europe, still existing self-description of most European states as welfare and redistributional strong states, meaning that this project is discursively able to mobilize public opinion for its aims. So if you come up with welfare in Germany or in Europe, it's still an issue. So most parties, even the German CDU, tells us something that they want to keep up general ideas about the welfare state. While in contrast to the National Social Hegemony Project, the Pro-European Social Hegemony Project envisages a pan-European strategy in defending the European social model. In its aim for social equality and redistribution, this hegemony project actively promotes Europeanization as an adequate reaction to the challenge of globalization and neoliberal competitiveness. And the relevant actors of this hegemony project are pro-European intellectuals like Jürgen Habermas, for example, or wings within the social democratic type of parties and unions in Europe, but also pro-European wings of the conservative parties like the former fraction around Helmut Kohl in the German CDU. He was a strong Europeanist, of course. On the other hand, protagonists for this pro-European social democratic hegemony project are to be found within ATTAC or the European Social Forum movement, for example. And one thing is important. It is important to keep in mind that these social projects are not the same and are not to be confused with the real existing social democratic or socialist parties in Europe. Almost all of these parties are by now part of the neoliberal project, as we would argue, which is also one of the main reasons, as Greg has mentioned in his outline, why the radical right is so successful at the moment. The idea, I think you picked it up, is defending of the social welfare state, the European welfare model, but in trying to defend it against the neoliberal project, the scalar strategies differentiate. The one is pro-European and the other says, keep it on the national framework because our fighting forces remain national. Another opposing factor, or sometimes aligning with the neoliberal one, is the mainly Eurosceptical national conservative hegemony project. Its main strategy is defending the nation and the national interests. In its attempt to defend the privileges of the national citizens, it is structurally nationalistic, stressing traditional values like the family, including traditional patriarchal attitudes regarding gender equality. With regards to migration, this project brings in the populist and racist resentments the tabloid press is using for its headlines in this policy area. The social basis for the national conservative hegemony project are parts of middle-sized and small capital with a mainly national or local basis, plus the agrarian sector. Among the subaltern, its supporting basis lies in those parts of the working class that is facing to be outclassed or already is part of the low-paid sector in workfare programs. The main actors here are the already mentioned fractions of national middle-sized and small capital, the petty bourgeoisie, and conservative political parties and politicians. The resources of this project lie, first of all, in its ties to the conservative sectors of society and its material resources, which often include relevant sectors of the tabloid press. Furthermore, in most European countries, the conservative parties were and are very relevant in the political party spectrum. And fifth, finally, for the just briefly outlining the hegemony projects, we found, and this is of course due to the fact that we've been doing research in migration policy issues. If we would have doing something about financial issues, probably wouldn't have found a left-wing alternative project that is to be heard. But in Germany or in Europe, there are rather strong NGOs and groups who even work on a European scale. And so we name these actors the left-wing alternative hegemony, or liberal left-wing alternative hegemony project. The strategy of this project is to enhance a normative political citizenship approach out of the tradition of political liberalism, tolerance, and human rights, including minority rights. This project is a condensation of those non-governmental actors, civil society initiatives, and social movements that do not primarily act along an economic axis. The social base of this project are the green urban middle classes. Its main actors are the diverse non-governmental movements and organizations following 68, including the New Women's Movement, the Ecological Movement, and the Peace and Anti-Racist Movement. And even though that the economic resources of this hegemony project are rather weak compared to the other ones, its main resources lies in the mobilization of public discourse through scandalization and civil disobedience. And therefore, sometimes it's quite successful. Maybe we have time later on, I could tell you a story about how they were successful in sending back asylum seekers back to Greece due to the circumstances in the asylum homes in Greece. And these 5 hegemony projects not only act on a national scale in Germany, but also on a European scale compared to each country. And what I'm going to elaborate in the next minutes is how this constellation of relationship of forces or this hegemony projects fueled into the debates and outcomes of the Euro crisis, which, as already mentioned, also led to the uprising of the AfD in Germany. And in doing so, we identified 5 phases. I mean, being a Poulan-Sassian, I'm into periodization of the whole thing, and it's 5 phases that we identified. And in the first phases, which started in 2007, as you all know, with the crisis and the breakdown of Lehman Brothers in September 2008, the crisis was identified as an exogenous US event, as we discussed it in Europe and Germany. And the predominant European reaction to this was a rather pragmatic move to save the involved banks to prevent the crisis to become a systemic crisis. Counteracting its traditional austerity and anti-inflation policies, the European Central Bank injected cash into the European markets to counteract bottlenecks in the interbanking markets. It is also in this phase that the European finance ministers agreed on a coordinated European way of crisis management. Besides several national economic stimulus programs, governments agreed on a European economic recovery plan with a total volume of 200 billion euros, and the European Commission supported this with an additional 30 billion euros taken from the European budget funds. It is important to keep in mind that these huge sums for saving the banks meant at the same time a substantial liability for the public households. Taking it all together, the amount spent for the savings were 2.5% of the GDP of the Eurozone countries. If we look at the acceptances of liabilities, these were 9.4% of, and guarantees for saving deposits had a value of 20.1% of the Eurozone GDP. And looking at this, what becomes clear is that almost all countries have mobilized enormous financial resources to counteract the crisis and to save their banks, which also shows that the deficits and debts have risen seriously, and at the same time the main burden lies on employees and socially weak groups of society, while firms, capital owners, and top earners have generally been unburdened. So you see the debt level before and after the crisis, which is due to the fact that they spent at least enormous sums to save the banks. In the second phase, a slight discursive change took place, including a more general critique against the neoliberal agenda, as we could observe. Even though the predominant crisis analysis still was that the crisis is an exogenous event at that time, mainly coming from the US, a wider debate started in which a re-regulation of the European markets, the regulation of rating agencies, and other rather progressive elements were on the agenda. But this, as we know, didn't last for a long time, and it was in the following third phase where the major European crisis programs have been implemented that the discourse changed again. Now the major focus was, due to the fact that the new Greece government at that time was committing of being close to insolvency, the focus was on the European debitor states. Thereby the crisis analysis shifted away from a more general critique against capitalism. Even in the conservative Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, we had a series about the future of capitalism at that time. I mean, the conservative press was asking itself, is there a future for capitalism? But as we saw, this window closed very early. And the analysis shifted away from this critique against the hegemonic neoliberal order to a harsh and often populist criticism against the Southern European debitor or crisis states. They were now blamed for their deficits and their corrupt elites for which the rich northern states were not willing to pay their debts, as we could read it in the German tabloid press about these lazy Greeks and all this type of things. Against this populist backdrop, it was no wonder, as I would argue, that the implementation of the European crisis programs was again in line with strict fiscal discipline, austerity politics, and a cutback in welfare state programs, like the southern states had to agree if they wanted to get money from the rescue programs. And now I come back closely to Germany, especially Germany, under the then conservative neoliberal coalition, which was the FDP, which yesterday announced that it's dropping out of these negotiations. At that time, the FDP was part of the government. The neoliberal FDP and the conservative party of Angela Merkel was leading. And France, at that time under the conservative government of Nicolas Sarkozy, were strong supporters for these European austerity and disciplinary programs. And the question is, what I'm going to elaborate in the next minutes, what specific reasons or relationships of forces stood behind this. Just briefly about phase 4, at that time, Syriza for the first time, at that time it was defeated in June 2012, and Mario Draghi announced in July of 2012 to do whatever it takes to save the Eurozone crisis, and which this finally has led to a reverse peak, and that a slow process of relaxation took place. Following this, one could observe again a slight change in the crisis politics, in which especially the ECB started an expansionary monetary policy in reducing its interest rates. It was also in this phase in which the crisis of Cyprus took place, which was solved in March 2013. And with the solution of the crisis in Cyprus, it seemed that the Eurozone crisis had come to a halt. Only disturbing events were the success of right-wing and populist parties in the elections for the European Parliament in May 2014. Besides a return to the normal economic problems in France, Italy, and elsewhere, it seemed that the height of the Eurozone crisis has sustainably been left behind. But, as we know, since the electoral success of Syriza in January 2015, we could see a heightening of tensions between an authoritarian European power bloc and the challenging position or opposition of Syriza in Greece and probably Podemos in Spain and also in Portugal, which, as we all know, was finally a major defeat for them and a success for authoritarian statist neoliberalism, led by the German Finance Minister Schäuble and the Eurogroup. And as I said, I will concentrate now on phase 3, where most of the authoritarian European crisis programs have been brought on their way, which is also the phase where in Germany the at that time mainly ordoliberal Alternative für Deutschland appeared. Let's just have a brief look at the central elements of those crisis programs heading under the general label of a new economic governance that have been implemented since Greece almost had to declare of being insolvent. First, this European Financial Stability Facility, which is now the European Stability Mechanism. This is the European Bailout Fund that, together with the European Financial Stability Mechanism and the IMF, provided 750 billion euros as guarantees and credits, which are of course not for free. The countries applying for support have to implement structural adjustment programs as we know them from IMF programs for countries in the global south in the recent decades. This fund, that is being successed by the ESM as a permanent rescue fund in 2013, has been supplemented by further programs like, for example, the so-called Six-Pack or the Euro Plus Pact. The general aim of these programs is to enhance financial discipline and to strengthen the position of the European Commission, and here especially the position of the Economic General Directorate ECFIN, through a newly installed task force in which the then President of the European Council, Herman van Rompuy, had taken over the lead. Thus, in programs like the European semester, the European Commission observes and controls national fiscal plannings, whether they are in line with the deficit criteria, and gives recommendations. And if they are not in line, the Commission reserves the right to propose concrete counteracting policies that are then to be only rejected with a so-called reverse majority voting, which means that within 10 days, a majority of the member states has to be organized against these measures, otherwise the sanctions are taken for granted. What I learned in my studies in political science about democracy was quite a different thing, but this is what they came up about. And finally, the European Fiscal Treaty. This treaty has been mainly pushed by the German Chancellor Merkel and the former President Franz Sarkozy, and that has been signed in 2012 without the UK and the Czech Republic, and therefore it is not part of the European treaties. This fiscal treaty includes automatic sanctions for countries who signed in and are not obliging to the strict deficit criteria, and it includes the need for the implementation of a debt brake, Schuldenbremse in Germany, into the national constitutions. The European Court of Justice plays an exceptional role here, since each ratifying state may bring enforcement proceedings against any other ratifying state before the Court of Justice if they do not fulfill their obligations under the Fiscal Compact to enact the required implementation law within 1 year after the treaty's entry into force. A state found in breach of this obligation will first be issued a warning, but can ultimately be fined up to 0.1% of its GDP if it fails to correct the issue. So there's a rather punitive disciplinary development taking place in which the European institutions have taken over. Let's have a look. How did it come that these authoritarian programs have been implemented in phase 3? And my argument is that, as I already said, it was especially Germany, led by Chancellor Merkel, and not necessarily supported by the FDP at that time. Chancellor Merkel and Finance Minister Schäuble, who had been very influential at that time. And that Germany was so successful in pushing through its interests was not only related to the fact that Germany and a group of Nordic states was able to recover rather quickly from the beginnings of the crisis, but this is also based on the relative dominance of creditor interests in the European monetary, economic, and financial politics. As we have seen, has it been the banks who in the first phase of the crisis have benefited from the state-funded rescue programs? They first of all have been able to prevent public or state influence into their decision-making, which secondly gave them the chance to recover rather quickly from the crisis without any need for a real change of their operative and speculative investment strategies. With regards to the question which relationship of forces, mainly observing Germany and the German debate, are to be identified against these European austerity programs, our analysis showed first of all that there's a simple truth. The debt of one country or one country's bank is the gain of another. So if we look here, for example, what Germany has borrowed to Greece or to Ireland, and what France has borrowed to Greece and Ireland. Now, Ireland is not so important there. We could see that there was a lot of money from German banks being spent to Greece, and of course they were highly pressuring the German government to get their money back. So this, I would say, is a very structural feature within the negotiations that took place at that time about the rescue programs. But if we have a closer look at especially the German relationship of forces, we can observe, and here comes the issue that Greg already mentioned in his outline, we can observe a crack or drift within the neoliberal hegemony project. And following our analysis, there was an implicit and pressuring coalition between the National Conservative project and an ordoliberal fraction of the neoliberal hegemony project that argued for the withdrawal from European crisis solutions and the giving up of the euro as a common currency generally. So there was two fractions coming together. They say, step out of the euro, let it go, either have a Nordic euro or bring back the D-Mark or whatever. So they were highly pressuring within this neoliberal project. But opposing this fraction, or the splitting faction, we could see two more opposing factions. That was an authoritarian neoliberal but pro-European fraction that was being backed up by the main industrial associations, finance capital, and the leading newspapers like the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in Germany. This fraction argued that the euro is highly beneficial for the German export and financial sectors. Furthermore, the crisis was being seen as a window of opportunity for a European shock strategy, you could argue. And maybe we could see what we labeled a neoliberal re-regulation fraction. This fraction consisted of the pretending to be, I would say, moderate left within neoliberal German social democracy, at that time led by the then Chancellor candidate and former Finance Minister Per Steinbrück. Its aim was a pragmatic center-left position to save neoliberalism with embedding it into a new Green Deal or the like. Its constitutive strategy and key political projects were a limited re-regulation of financial markets and transactions. They did not totally reject haircuts and were in favor of an expansionary economic and monetary policy. But they nevertheless agreed on the usefulness and necessity of austerity policies like the fiscal compacts or flexible labor markets. Opposing this constellation of hegemony project and their cracks and fissures was the newly emerging project that we have labeled a Euro-leftist alliance. Key actors were, as already mentioned, Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, or Die Linke in Germany, plus NGOs like Attac or social movements like the Blockupy movements in Germany and several other European protest movements. Thus, my argument is that it was this specific constellation that stays behind the authoritarian statist European programs. The split within the neoliberal project against the opposition of the Euro-leftist alliance, whose offensive was crystallizing in the negotiations with the Syriza government about the solutions to the Greek financial crisis, which are at the same time was a crisis of the Eurozone in general. The German government, under the leadership of Chancellor Merkel and Finance Minister Schäuble, in fact used the pressure from the right, the implicit coalition of the National Conservatives with the Ordo Liberals, and the pressure from the Greek left and the pro-European left on the other side to push through its authoritarian European programs. But the flip side of this constellation was a growing frustration and anger at the side of the conservative Ordo Liberal coalition. Especially within the neoliberal FDP, guy yesterday, Lindner, stepping out of the negotiations, especially within the neoliberal FDP, a radical ordo-liberal faction became apparent and stepped into the offensive, which brought the party under enormous pressure. With the defeat of this coalition, due to Angela Merkel's and Wolfgang Schäuble's decision to support and push the authoritarian European neoliberal crisis policies, the split became obvious, which finally led to the foundation of the AfD in 2013 as an umbrella organization for the dissenters. One result of the split in this camp was also that the FDP, the neoliberal FDP, didn't make it into the German parliament in the general elections in 2013, and the segregated AfD had almost made it in with 4.7%. Since in Germany we have a 5% limit. Is it limit? You know what?
Threshold.
Threshold, thank you. Since then, the party, the AfD, was establishing itself as an authoritarian national neoliberal force that at the same time had some enormous magnetic effects on the German xenophobic and racist radical right. That, as Marx would have probably argued, is supported and elected by large parts of the German Lumpenproletariat. But to be very clear, this radical and racist right was also ensnared and schmoozed by the party's ordo-liberal founder Bernd Lucke from the very beginning. But since we also know from Goethe's Sorcerer's Apprentice, who could not rid himself of the spirits he conjured up, Lucke in July 2015 finally lost the inner party struggle within the AfD, and the radical right took over step by step. But also one of the chief mutinees, who after Lucke became party leader, Frauke Petry, finally withdrew from the party after she 8 weeks ago obtained a seat in the German Bundestag. Let's see how this works out. 2 more pages, Greg. just a little reflection, I mean, me being this Poulantzas guy and authoritarian statism. Well, one question I would like to elaborate, finishing my presentation, is the question whether these authoritarian crisis programs will be able to cope with the crisis sufficiently. And the question is, yeah, the European Commission, of course, was arguing we need a strong executive to deal with these menace, we need a disciplinary regime, we need a punishing European regime. Well, an answer that Poulantzas was giving at his time, when he was observing the crisis of Fordism in the late 1970s, was also related to the fact how the executive works during a crisis. Poulantzas argued here that in the crisis of Fordism, that in this crisis the Fordist state, a shift in, to quote, a shift in governmental responsibility took place away from parliaments to the summits of the executive that has brought with it a decisive curtailment of parliament's authority over the administration. Government has become autonomous from parliament and the administration distanced from the process of national representation, unquote. This autonomization of the executive and the shift of decision-making to the administration and the bureaucracy is also related, following Poulantzas, to a, quote, sharpening of the contradictions within the dominant classes, unquote, or a, quote, permanent instability of the bourgeoisie's hegemony in the dominant countries. But these autonomization processes seeking to counteract the crisis of Fordism, paradoxically, as he argues, becomes itself an important factor of destabilization that might go beyond a straightforward economic crisis. This is related to the fact that, to quote, the selective aid to individual capitals that massively favor the strictly economic corporate interests of certain fractions has the snowballing involvement of the state in economic contradictions merely broadens the cracks in the power block. It lends them a political character and becomes a direct factor of political crisis, constantly calling into question the state's organization of hegemony and the general interest of the bourgeoisie, unquote. And to finish, it is probably a little too early to argue that the authoritarian statist European crisis policies and the cracks within the European and German power blocks will lead to these results, but following Poulantzas again, one could say that an authoritarian statist Europe remains a clay-footed colossus fleeing ahead on treacherous ground, and it should be remembered that wild animals are most dangerous when they are wounded. Thank you.